Sì, sì. Sì, 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 sì.
One on a chair and then there's this one and then there's one light as well. Testing, testing, 1 2 1 2, testing, testing, 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2, testing, 1 2 1 2 3 4 5 6, testing, testing, 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2, testing, 1 2.
Your election.
I'm fine.
Okay.
Okay, I'm just going to do the housekeeping before we start. Thank you very much. Everybody's great packed room, and I know the reason why. I know Nuala's a bit nervous because we had Baroness Nuala O'Loan yesterday, and I know she was really entertaining, but, you know, no pressure. You'll be fine. Housekeeping before we start, okay? I'm just going to do the housekeeping, and I'm going to hand over to Paul. So, what do we do first? Knock off the phone. Silent. At Garden of tweeting's fine if you're on Twitter. At Garden of Reflection. Tweet away. We're also live streaming. So I've already tweeted it out there. So you want to tweet that as well, so people will know it's out there. Okay. We're not expecting a fire drill. In the unlikely event, there's a lot of people in the room who would ask you to leave in an orderly fashion. There are Hollywood Trust staff in the room who will assist the evacuation. You can out these doors and then out onto Bishop Street and onto the Diamond. Gosh, I forgot where I was there for a minute. And actually out back into the garden as well and out onto Pump Street, okay, if we can't get out that way. Just the sign-in sheet around the room today. Yes, thank you, Marjorie. Sign-in sheet, for those of you that are familiar with our events, just let it keep going around the room, and if you haven't signed it before the end, come and find it and sign it. Sometimes people get missed, but that's okay. That's all I have to say, except thanks all for coming. I'm going to hand straight over to our Master of Ceremonies, who's done a wonderful job already for us. If you've been here earlier, we launched the garden this morning, and we're just delighted. And Paul hosted the whole event, and we did a fantastic job. So thank you, Paul. We'll give him a wee round of applause.
I'll find that
Sorry, is that on Mark?
Okay, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, you're all very welcome here to the Holywell Trust Diverse City Partnership premises in Bishop Street in Derry, Londonderry, where today we've had the formal launch of the Garden of Reflection. I think many of you will have been here for that particular occasion. It's a moment to savour for the people in this building, and it's something I think which everybody in this community will applaud, hopefully support, and most important of all, benefit from. There is one small piece of housekeeping which I think I should just complete before I introduce our guest speaker for today. Today happens to be the 55th birthday of the MP for Foyle, who has suddenly gone very red here. He's at the back of the hall here, Mark Durkin. But many happy returns, Mark. So, 55. I'm 54, and he's at least 6 years ahead of me at school. You know, so there. But many happy returns. To the serious business. Anyone who was following the news today will be aware that we've had another sombre reminder of the darkness which we, as a community, are struggling to emerge from. Investigators searching for the body of one of the disappeared have recovered what appear to be 2 sets of remains. At once, this news illustrates the importance for our community, for our society to move forward, but it also illustrates in the most horrible way, really, the difficulty for this community in doing so. The past keeps turning up. On this occasion, the formal launch of the Garden of Reflection, I can hardly I honestly can hardly think of a more appropriate guest, nor one whose views I would be more eager to hear than this lady's. Hers is one of the foremost legal minds in these islands. She is an academic, a commentator, a PRS. She has held the Jean Monnet Chair in European Law. She is the chairman of the governing body of the National University of Ireland. She was appointed an Irish government special envoy to East Timor. Her list of achievements and roles goes on and on. But she's perhaps best known for having been the first police ombudsman for Northern Ireland And in that role and in others, she has shone a light into some of the darkest reaches of the troubles and of our history. People who don't know her invariably use the F word to describe her, and I mean formidable. Although I think some others may have used another F word on some occasions in the past, but we'll gloss over that. I will have the honour and privilege of engaging in conversation with her shortly, and after that you will also have an opportunity to ask questions of her. But first of all, she is going to deliver a presentation to us on this, as I say, auspicious occasion for the Diverse City Partnership, the formal launch of the Garden of Reflection project. Please welcome to the stage Baroness Nuala O'Loan. Baroness O'Loan.
You sit there, Paul. Sit there.
Glad you listening.
Well, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yeah. It's very good to be with you today. Now, Mark told me yesterday as we stood in the central lobby in Westminster that he had meetings today, so I'm very honoured that you're here, and a very happy birthday, Mark. You didn't tell me that. But it's great to be here to celebrate the opening of the Garden of Reconciliation, because it's such a beautiful idea, and I think it will be such a gentle space within which the people of Derry, Londonderry, can enjoy and come participate in so many different things. I know you had my noble colleague May Blood yesterday, and I know that May is a very hard act to follow. I am not funny, May is funny. She's very funny. How many of you heard her? Yeah, she's very good, isn't she? Anyway, she's given great service over the years, especially in the Shankle Road area, and she's a good friend. But I want to talk to you about somber, solemn things, I think. And it's really the outstanding issues that we face as a society. I want to talk about what we can learn from our experiences so that those whom we love and those for whom we're trying to create a better world, don't have to endure what so many of us had to endure. And I read yesterday, and I was very disappointed to read it, that the number of people being forced out of their homes, intimidated by paramilitaries, is several hundred a year still. And I can remember coming up here to Derry to talk on an occasion previously when it was a real problem of people being expelled from the city and not allowed to be here and not allowed to come back. And obviously there were people who tried to come back and didn't make it. So we have that still going on. We have a huge level of sectarianism one way or another across Northern Ireland. And last year 3 people died, and there were 94 paramilitary shootings and assaults. And there were bombs recovered, and there were 26 bombing incidents. So we've still got a problem. But I think many of you will have spent your lives working for peace or supporting those who work for peace. And I do think that Derry, Londonderry, has to some extent led Northern Ireland in the way in which it's moved forward to deal with peace, because I think things like parades became much less of an issue here in Derry long before they managed to settle a bit more across the rest of Northern Ireland. And I think the statue, the peace statue on the bridge, is a symbol really of what's been achieved here. So I'd like to congratulate everyone who's been involved over the years for the work they've done. But I want to think for a minute about what goes on in peacemaking, because I think that reconciliation and forgiveness and healing are actually at the heart of it. And I think that's why the kind of things that you're doing here in Derry are so important. And I know you've had many, many distinguished speakers over the past year. Now, I've worked in many different areas. I've worked, as Paul told you, as a special envoy for the Irish government. But I've been from Palestine to Liberia, from Northern Ireland, in its very difficult context, to Timor-Leste. And I know that people have so much in common, and that the problems which they share and the solutions they try to create are very often common. And we can actually learn from each other's torment. For 2 years, we ran a program bringing together women from Liberia, Timor, and Northern Ireland, and some from the south of Ireland, exploring what enabled women to survive conflict, and to identify the problems which they faced during the conflict, and to identify the things that worked for them in the context in which they operated. And it was really, really interesting to watch the 3 groups of women working together. And we went, we brought the Liberians and the Timorese to Belfast, and we took the Northern Ireland and Timor to Liberia, and we all went to Liberia, etc. So we did all 3 countries. And I remember when they came to Belfast, we took them on a tour of the Troubles in Belfast. And they came back and they just had their mouths open. And they said, "What's this about?" So I said, what about? "You build walls." "Yes." "You're supposed to be at peace." This was 2009, 10. "You're supposed to be at peace, and you're building more walls. How can you make peace if you can't talk to each other? And you can't talk to each other if you've got walls." They just couldn't get their heads around our solution to the problem. And we explained to them that people felt they needed the walls to protect them, etc., etc. But it's very interesting to watch how people react to conflict and the solutions that they identify and how they do and don't apply. So I don't think one of the things I've learned is we can't just translate what happened here and take it across the world and say we know all the answers. We don't. But when the great peacemakers of the world get together, you know, they talk in peacemaking terms about things like disarmament, laying down the weapons, decommissioning, destroying the weapons, demobilization, getting all the combatants to go home, prisoner release, reintegration of combatants into society, resettlement of people who've been displaced as a consequence of whatever troubles there've been, truth commissions, memorials, special arrangements for short sentences and amnesties. And many of these things have to happen if a country's going to move from war to peace. And many of them had to happen here. And for many, different bits of them were quite difficult. For me, as Police Ombudsman, things like the amnesty provisions in the decommissioning legislation and in the recovery of the disappeared legislation meant that we lost a lot of evidence which might have otherwise brought people to justice. But that's how it is, and we have to work at that. We need it if we're going to stop the bombing and the shooting. And as I said, we still have a problem. But I think there's a very clear need to recognise that the heart of any peace process, it's just healing, forgiveness and reconciliation between individuals. And it can be so difficult if you've suffered in the troubles or if you've suffered as a consequence of someone else's evil. But I think all these things, all the decommissioning and the demobilisation and the et cetera, and reconciliation and forgiveness and healing, they all come together. And by coming together, they create a functional society. Nothing is perfect, but a functional society. And I think if we don't allow truth, if we resist reconciliation, then the trauma and the anguish and all the unfinished business will continue to echo through our days until eventually we're forced to deal with them. And the suspicion and the distrust which run through our society, which reaches to the very highest levels, will continue to undermine what I think is still a very fragile peace. You know, after every conflict there's debate. Debate about the legacy of the past. About whether if you try and deal with the legacy of the past, you'll undo the present. And about the cost of addressing past injustice, the cost of failing to do so. Northern Ireland's no different from anywhere else. If you look at the legacy of the Troubles for the people of Northern Ireland, you can see it. You can see it in high levels of trauma, mental illness, people living with pain, very high suicide levels, high levels of alcohol and drug substance abuse, high levels of poverty and unemployment. And in some cases, and I have met many of them, just sheer hopelessness. I remember sitting in a room in East Belfast with a group of UVF people. I was asked to come and meet the community, and the person who asked me to come, when I got there, said to me, "I'm very sorry, Nuala." She said, it's actually the UVF you're meeting. And I said, "That's fine." It wasn't quite fine, because I was kind of investigating them at the time, you know. But it was fine. But they were so angry and so distressed by the way they felt they'd been led up to the top of the hill and led into doing things which they'd done and for which they'd served prison sentences, and their children had suffered. And the guys who had led them up to the top of the hill were well away from it all and didn't serve the prison sentences. And in their areas, they were still abandoned. And there was that hopelessness about it. And that's one of the things that we actually have to acknowledge, I think. But I think, too, there's an amazing resilience in our people. Absolutely amazing. And I think you see it here in Derry. You see it across so many fronts, from schools. There's some great schools up here. I know that because I do a lot of prize givings and all sorts of things like that. You've great industry. You haven't got enough of it, but you need more. But you've got the University of Ulster at Magee, where I used to teach. You've got tourism, arts, and the culture, for which Derry is so famous. So different solutions in different parts of the world to different problems. The models are there, but there's fear. Fear that if we face our realities, we'll be separated. And conflict, the way we experienced our conflict, is always messy. And there are fears and expectations that what might emerge such as through a hearing like the South African Truth Commission, will actually be more damaging than the good it'll do. That it'll contradict the received wisdom in each element of the community, and that it won't be the whole truth anyway. But you know, in South Africa, where we're told there was this very successful Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 7,116 people applied for amnesty in return for telling their story. But only 1,176 got their amnesty. And even in many of those cases, people said they hadn't told the whole story. And if you talk to the people of South Africa, if you walk the streets with them, they will tell you, he did this, he did that. It's there in every society, even where attempts have been made to resolve it. And there's no question that Desmond Tutu and people like that really tried in South Africa. Conflict has many impacts that we don't always remember. I think of a group of young Palestinian schoolgirls I met. They were living as displaced people. I met them in a place called Camp Gaza in Jordan. They were living on the side of a high, dusty mountain. It took us hours to drive through the desert to get to them. They'd been there. These people have been in Camp Gaza since 1976, and I met them last year. They're displaced people. The only people who can help them, they're not refugees. Jordan won't allow them to have the status of refugees. They just can't accommodate any more refugees. So the displaced people, they've got the United Nations Welfare Relief Association, which is established to care for Palestinian people in exile. That's their sole function, but they've very few resources. They can't go back to Gaza. They've no identity. They've no right to work in the public service. They've no homeland that they can live in. They've no ability to travel, and they've no ability to experience the world. And these girls were really beautiful, and UNRWA had provided them with new school uniforms. They were all Muslim girls with their veils and things. They were absolutely gorgeous. And so we sat in a room with them, and one of the things that struck me most was I started to talk. I was leading a delegation of peers and MPs, and I started to talk about why we're there and how we wanted to hear from them. And a little girl started to cry, sitting there in her green hijab and her uniform. And I thought, why is she crying anyway? It was disconcerting, but I carried on talking. And we did what we had to do, and then we had a little break, and they provided us with little biscuits, and we provided them with some stuff we bought. And I said to one of the teachers, what is wrong with her? And she said, come and I'll introduce you. She was 13 years old. For 12 and a half of her years, she'd lived in Dublin. She had been born and brought up in Dublin. Her mother had become ill. She'd been unable to take care of the children. The father had come back from the Gaza camp and taken his 4 children and taken to the Gaza camp. And this little girl who'd grown up in Dublin, who'd been to McDonald's, who went to the swimming pool, who wanted to go to Oxford, she's stuck in this camp where there's no hope. So it really struck me, and it was my accent that made her cry. We asked them anyway what they dreamed of. And I want you to think about this in the context of your own children and children across the world, because this is what they said as they sat in this school, very poor, just awful. They said, we want to be recognised as human beings with rights and not as people with no identity who are helpless. We want to be able to own property. We want not to be poor, to be able to work. We want something to do outside school hours. What they do outside school hours, they go home, they do housework. That's it. We don't want to see so many relatives sitting at home useless, because when you grow up and stop going to school, there's nothing to do. So you just sit at home, useless, unable to do anything. We don't want to be useless. We want a good education. We will write and study even if we can't go to university. And they had a couple of computers, and they were very well informed. They knew all about One Direction and things I didn't know about. Some of them wanted to study medicine. One of them wanted to be a cinematic director. I hardly knew what that was, you know. They didn't want to be forced into early marriages, and they didn't want to become pregnant in their early teens, and they wanted to be happy. They said, everything is about grieving here. Even when it seems there might be some happiness, it always ends in sadness for all that's been lost. We want to make a contribution to the world in which we live. And theirs is a terrible existence, and their families have lived like that since 1976, and there doesn't seem to be any hope. And then I think too of the children of Timor. Timor, you know, there's 1.2 million people or something in Timor. It's very similar to Northern Ireland. Their conflict ran from 1975 to 2006, really. And there were 100,000 people, 500,000 people displaced, 100,000 people killed in that population. So 1 in 10 of the population died. But the children said this, and it describes their experience far better than I could tell you about it. They said, women and children don't have a place to live and be at peace. Women and children must stay in tents and give birth in inappropriate places. Children have lost their rights to go to school, to play, to sleep peacefully. Women want leaders who listen to the voices of the humble people, especially women and children. They said, we want to go back home. We don't want to sleep on ground covered with dew. We want to go to school because we are the nation's future. We want to play in peace. We don't want to hear the sound of guns. We don't want to see the blood spilling in our homes and our neighbours' homes. And we don't want to see our homes and our neighbours' homes burnt down. And as I sat and listened and thought about this, I was thinking, but Ireland has seen so much of this. Our children saw so much of this growing up. Not our young people, but the children of my generation and the older generations. And when I said this to the people of Timor, they said, nonsense. They said, it's not like this for you. They said, we haven't shoes to go to school. I said, 70 years ago, the people of Ireland, many of them didn't have shoes to go to school either. And it's cold in Ireland, you know. So I think one of the most important things about the work of reconciliation is protecting the women and children in society, because they're really the ones who hold it all together as it falls apart. I think it's profoundly important. I think one of the problems we have with this thing we call truth is that we don't know what it is. It's never simple. We know, for example, if you think about the collusion programs that have been on, that the security forces infiltrated the paramilitary groups. We know that some of the people who became agents of the state were allowed to go on committing the most serious of crimes. And we know that collusion was a fact of life and that it happened in Republican and in Loyalist areas. You know, I'm currently monitoring an investigation called Operation Stafford, which is being conducted by the Police Service of Northern Ireland. It emerged from one of my Police Ombudsman investigations of the UVF in North Belfast. But there's one man charged, he was in court yesterday, charged with, if I remember correctly, 212 really serious offences: murder, attempted murder, extortion, intimidation, arson, and 304 taken into account. 212 serious offences, murders, etc., 304 taken into account. That's just one person. How do we deal with it? How do we even get through the trial of something like that? I read in the paper yesterday or today that there are 12,000 pages of evidence just in terms of disclosure for him. So there are huge issues there about what we do and how we try to undo and unpack the history of the past, to do justice, because we have to have a society which is based on the rule of law. And we know too that both sets of paramilitary groups imposed pain on their own communities. And it's hard to say these things and sometimes hard to acknowledge them, but those are the realities of life. And Paul mentioned there the agonies of the disappeared, you know, those families whose loved ones were taken away by the IRA. But Kevin McKee, and he was 17, and Seamus Wright, I think, was a similar age when the two of them were abducted. I think they may be the two who have been found yesterday when they were looking for Joe Linsky. Joe Linsky was a bit older. But there are still 7 people missing, and we include in that Lisa Dorian, although she's not officially one of Northern Ireland's disappeared, because it seems very clear that she was the victim of UVF, I think it was UVF murder. And we also know that there are probably other people whose loved ones were disappeared who haven't been declared formally disappeared. But they're thought, for sound reason, to have been abducted, murdered and buried by paramilitaries during the conflict. That is still living in our society, and that is still something we have to address. And that's part of every conflict society. And we have the Stormont House Agreement, and with great respect to Mark, I don't understand how our politicians got us into a position in which we are trading off welfare reform for dealing with the past, for healing the injuries and the conflict and the pain of the past. And I don't blame Mark at all, because I know it's not his fault. But there's, you know, welfare, any system can always be reformed. Welfare reform is necessary. It's an aging, outdated, expensive system that's open to abuse. And there's something wrong when someone on welfare is earning so much more, or is receiving so much more than someone who's in work. My youngest son, who graduated from university 3 years ago, said to me not long ago that having come through university, he had finally reached the grand height of earnings that he had had before he went to university when he was working in a shop. He's now working in a shop in a big, as a what's called a visual merchandiser, but he is earning less than the guys who are on the dole, his friends who are on the dole. I said to him, I don't care, son, keep working. But I think there's something wrong too if you've got an elderly person with one spare bedroom that might be occupied by a son or daughter coming home to visit. And the bedroom tax effectively means that either they move house and there may be nowhere to go, or they suffer a deduction of their income because they've got this spare room if they're living in public sector housing. So we do have a lot of problems and we need to solve them. But we could do things better, and I think we have to acknowledge that. But we have to find a language to talk about things. And one of the big things we have to find a language to talk about is victims. When you think about victims, we don't invest sufficiently in the care of our victims. That's the first thing. I was speaking at Queen's recently, and I did some research about the Victim and Survivors Fund, the service, and how much money actually comes out to victims. And I actually thought I got it wrong, and I went back and checked, and I went back and checked again, and I checked with Wave, and if I'm wrong, please tell me I'm wrong, because I actually want to be wrong. But the total amount of funding granted by the Victim and Survivors Service in Northern Ireland to help everyone who's bereaved, wounded or traumatised by the Troubles for the 2 years from 2013 to 2015 was £12,377,512. That's providing everything, the electric wheelchairs that might cost £10,000 each, that somebody needs to have, you know, some sort of dignity and independence. In 2013, when we spent £6 million on the victims, we spent £23 million policing parades and protests. We're spending £30,000 a night to police the Loyalist protest at Twaddell Avenue, but we can't afford to run our local services. And that's been ongoing since the 12th of July 2013. Think what the 20 million or so which we've spent on Twaddell would have brought us, would have brought people who are suffering. It would have brought 460,000 physiotherapy treatments. And I know that people who suffered limb losses and serious debilitating injury in the Troubles have to choose, because of the allocation of funding, between pain relief and physio. And yet we could have had 460,000 additional physio sessions. We could have had 31,000 hours of nursing care. Think of the shortage of nurses. We could have had 3,700 hip operations. Think of the people who can't get out of their homes because they need hips. There's something wrong with our priorities, and we're afraid to address what's wrong with our priorities because we're afraid to offend the other. And it seems to me that nobody is willing to do what's right because they fear doing what's right lest it cause more trouble. And there's another thesis I want to share with you. It's the good victims, bad victims thesis. And it goes like this. There are innocent victims, and there are those who have blood on their hands, and we have to distinguish between them. But the reality of the people I've met is that a person who is limbless because a bomb exploded prematurely when he was a young combatant, for example, feels the same ongoing pain and knows the same difficulties, for example, with prosthetic limbs and phantom pains as the victim who was caught in that bomb explosion. And I've thought and thought about this. And the one thing I've learned after almost, and I've only lived here for 40 years, but things are so complex that I think all we can do is to seek to apply the rule of law and compassionately try to address the pain and suffering of decades, no matter where the pain and suffering is felt. If we don't, we will simply inflict that pain and suffering on future generations. And you know, many say there's no purpose in forgiveness if there's no repentance for bombing or for shooting, if there's no acknowledgement of the harm that was done. And yet I've learned what I think so many others have learned, and that is at the end of the day, grief and bitterness are both destructive and painful. And forgiveness, whatever it means, and I think it means different things for different people, is healing. I'm not telling anyone they have to forgive. To tell anyone they have to forgive is wrong. But I know that in forgiveness lies more healing, and in that healing lies the ability to move forward individually and to be part of a healing community of loyalists, Republicans, nationalists, unionists, or just people like me who don't espouse any cause but just want real peace. I think the churches could play a role here. I think that they could have a year for peace. I said this before. Little initiatives. If we do little things, we make a difference. You know that here in Derry. But if every church in the country decided it was going to have one little initiative every month even, would it bring people together? Would it heal some of those wounds? There's nothing new in what I'm saying. There's nothing new in the fact that the aftermath of conflict and wrongdoing doesn't go away. We know that you can't close down the past. If you just look across the world at history, we know that. In every society, there is eventually a recognition of the need to provide mechanisms to enable stories to be told, realities established, and insofar as it's possible, to pay compensation where it's necessary. I think our governments have a need to address those issues and not to avoid the fact that they have a responsibility as well. You know, one of the things that I learned was that from WAVE, they have had, I think it was a 52%, I wouldn't want to be quoted on it, but a very significant increase in the level of people referring for counselling. They are aged from 6 to 80. They are all troubles related. And the trauma of the troubles, the little 6-year-old who's living with somebody who lost their legs when they were 18 years old, that pain and the anguish of that person is passing through and affecting the life of the little one. And that is what will happen. We can't afford not to deal with the past. I think too much of the future depends on our ability to prove that we are a country at peace and one where there is the reality of the rule of law and not just an illusion. There's a man called Thomas Merton for whom I have a significant regard. He said, "Peace demands the most heroic labour and the most difficult sacrifice. It demands greater heroism than war, and it demands greater fidelity to the truth. But you have achieved so much here in Derry. The garden is just a symbol of it. The peace statue is a symbol of it. Far more symbolic are the gatherings that happen of ordinary people coming together. So I congratulate you on all you've done, and I thank you for listening to me in this warm afternoon. Thank you very much." You want to swap places? No, I don't mind.
Okay, your handbag's over here.
My handbag's over here.
I haven't been through the handbag
You wouldn't find anything?
yet. Okay, Baroness Nuala, thanks a million for
Nuala.
Well, I'll pick up on that. Actually, what is the correct way to address a peeress?
Peer of the realm.
A peer of the realm. What's the correct form of address?
Milady.
Milady, right?
Oh, Baroness.
Well, you're very
right.
welcome, milady. I feel like Parker and Thunderbirds there. You know, all of a sudden.
I look and see who are they talking to. Did you not? Oh, you went with May. You didn't call May, my lady.
I wasn't with her, no.
I hope you all called May, my lady.
She told me once to address her, or could address her as Lady Blood. But I like Nuala, you know. So thank you very much for being with us and for sharing your thoughts with us, first of all. There's a view of the House of Lords that it is a kind of a retirement home for the elderly, and yet I get the feeling that you, despite this, you know, distinguished career in which you have had many, many roles and done many, many really important things, I get the impression that you probably have never been as busy as you are at the moment. Is that an accurate perception?
Well, I know when I was Police Ombudsman, because I knew I only had 7 years, I worked very, very, very hard. But at the moment, I'm probably working equally hard. Yeah.
And what kind of things?
Well, I suppose at the moment there are two major things I'm doing. One is that I'm chairing an inquiry for the Home Secretary into the murder of a man called Daniel Morgan. And Daniel Morgan was murdered in 1987 in London. He was found with an axe in his face, dead. And the allegations are of police involvement in the murder and police collusion in covering up the murder. So it's all familiar territory. It's been running since, as I said, 1987. It impacts on things like the newspaper hacking inquiries, because there are allegations of newspapers influencing what was happening, etc., journalists involved, hacking, all sorts of things. So that I do 2 days a week, and now I do 2 days a week in the Lords too, and sometimes I do 2.5 days a week in the Lords. And in the Lords, it depends on what legislation is coming through. You know, you have to choose what you want to work on. But I also work on things like the abolition of the death penalty. Most recently I went to Uganda to try and persuade them, and we did manage to persuade them not to introduce the death penalty for homosexual acts, aggravated homosexual acts. They wanted to make that a capital offence. So I work on that. I work on justice and life issues and human rights issues. So it's a funny place, the House of Lords. You do think it's kind of a doddery old place where we all sit and sleep. I'm sure May explained to you about the red benches. You know the red benches we all sit on?
Yeah.
The microphones are here. So and the acoustics are bad. So when you're trying to listen, that's why you do that. So we're not all sleeping. Some of us sleep. But if you sat in a chair for 6 hours, because you're supposed to be there for most of a debate if you speak in it, if you sat in the chair for 6 hours, you might nod off. I think there were 1 or 2 nodding off in the 20 minutes I was speaking to you. So.
I like that. That's exactly what I'd expect a good lawyer to say, that the microphone's over here and, you know, the case for the defence. It's all a far cry, I imagine, from where it started for you.
Yeah, I mean, I
in
came
childhood.
from...
I mean, what kind of child were you? What kind of young woman were you?
I think it was probably quite difficult. I was, my father died...
Pretty difficult as an adult too, just for the record.
You're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to interview me if I get the best out of me. My father died when I was 13, so I was the oldest of 8 children. So my youngest brother was 18 months old and my mother was only 33, and we were desperately poor. I mean, one of the things I remember was, for my father's funeral, the only clothes I had to wear was my school uniform. The only decent clothes I had to wear, my school uniform. And it was in July. So we were very poor. And I very quickly learned that poor people don't know how to access even the things they're entitled to. And everything is much harder if you're poor. I mean, if you need to go somewhere and you've got to put the children into a buggy and then take the toddlers and then go and do the shopping and then carry it all home, it's much harder than if you can hop into a car and go and do it. So life's very real issues were there with me. From a very early age. My mother used to send me on a Saturday afternoon to the vegetable market at the end of the day, about 3:30, 4 o'clock, to pick up, you know, the stuff that was left over that would feed us all. So it was very difficult. So I always felt that there was something around justice that needed to be worked on. And that's really what brought me this strange route. I never had a big plan. I never thought I'd be in the House of Lords. I applied for Police Ombudsman because somebody told me I should. And I was looking for something different, and nobody more surprised than me when I got it. And I applied for the House of Lords because I was having difficulty getting a job. I can't imagine why, but...
But to have broken through that kind of disadvantage in childhood and that impoverished background suggests to me that either you were extraordinarily bright or very, very lucky.
I think I was very lucky in school. I won a scholarship and I went away to school.
So you must have been bright as well.
And I loved reading. I just loved reading, and I read every hour of the day. I didn't enjoy maths classes or physics classes or anything like that. I just used to sit myself at the back of the classroom with a book and just read quietly. And of course that is not a good way to go through your education. But I did get through. And I got to university, but I got a lot of support from my teachers. From a few people, you know, who really walked with me, from the local parish priest who became a good friend. So I think it's that support of people who come into your lives. And the nuns were great. They never, ever suggested you weren't going to university. So it never entered my little head that I wasn't going to university. And yet my brothers and sisters didn't make it, not initially anyway, you know, so they went later.
Why did you wind up going down the legal route at university and subsequently in your career?
I think it's, in part, it's to do with justice. It's to do with the only way you can assert your rights ultimately is through the application of the rule of law. So that even if you're working as a student, I worked in the Legal Advice Centre in Fulham. And God help the people who came in. They were mostly Russian refugees coming into London in the 70s. wanting to know about the housing rights and things like that. And I think they probably knew more about the housing rights than I did, but I knew that, you know, understanding the words and understanding how forms work and being able to fill in forms and all these basic things are so important. And so it's obvious when you sort of look at that sort of stuff then to move into law.
You could have had, I imagine, a reasonably comfortable and successful life working in the field of law in England, but you fetched up here in Northern Ireland.
My husband thought there was nowhere like Northern Ireland to live.
It was probably right, you know.
I was very naive. I didn't understand that things might be a little difficult here on occasion.
When was this, by the way?
This was 1976.
You moved to
We moved to
Northern
Northern
Ireland?
Ireland, yeah, right in the heart of it.
So it's all about timing, they say.
Yeah.
And
I love it. And, you know, apart from my time in Africa, I've been very, very happy here, and I wouldn't want to live in England now. I think there's something very special about the people here. Maybe it's because you've suffered, maybe it's, I don't know.
But could you say that you can't surely say that you always loved it? I mean, coming here in the mid-70s, shortly after the worst years of the conflict here.
Yeah, but you know, I mean, those of you who are old and grey like me will remember that it wasn't mayhem all the time. There were intrusions, there were bombs. Yes, I used to teach in Jordanstown, and you could hear them across the water, you know. And we had our bombs in Jordanstown, so there were moments that I found profoundly difficult. The shootings, listening to the news each morning, and then once Declan, my husband, got involved in politics, the risks attaching to that, they were very difficult to deal with.
Yeah, well, I would have thought one
and
of
then
the
the
most...
risks attaching to the things I was doing.
Yeah, of course, yeah, which maybe we'll explore again later on. But I mean, one of the most difficult moments surely in your life had to have been the time when you found yourself directly caught up in an explosion, which was at Jordanstown. Was it 77, was it? 1977? Explain what happened on that occasion.
Was very simple. I was pregnant, and we had the Lord Chief Justice in, and we hadn't told the students who was coming to speak to them, but we'd gathered them all, 250 of them, into the lecture theatre. And we walked into the lecture theatre with the Lord Chief Justice, McDermott, and retired Lord Chief Justice, McDermott. And as I walked in, one of my colleagues called me over and said to me, "Can we put students sitting down the steps? There are more people who want to come in." And I said, "No." Even at 26 or whatever, I said, "No, health and safety, we can't do that." And as that happened, the Lord Chief Justice moved across, and my colleague started to introduce him. I didn't want to go across and make an exhibition of myself, having sorted out that nobody else could come in. So I just moved into the second row, and 20 minutes into the lecture, the place blew up. And the ceiling came down, and there was a great mahogany desk right across the front of the lecture theatre, and it just exploded up. And we were really lucky because the ceiling was like this, it was this kind of stuff, and above that there's concrete. And the great shards, spears of mahogany embedded in the concrete, they didn't come out into the students. But I lost the baby. So these things happen. It's a very simple loss by comparison with the people I have worked with. You know, the mothers who've seen their children shot, the little girl who saw her two brothers shot while they're sitting watching Coronation Street, the little boy whose police officer father was murdered, the prison officer wife who told me about the murder of her husband. Those are real tragedies.
Yeah. One thing, and I'll try and say this as sensitively as I can and as diplomatically as I can, but one thing which it has allowed you to do, I suspect, which many English people who come to interfere in the internal affairs of Northern Ireland and so on can say, is that they don't really have any real sense of what it feels like to have suffered and to have lost as a result of the conflict here. You do, and you are obviously able to empathise in a way which many others can't. Yeah,
I think if you've lived the years of flashbacks, it took me a long time to get over the flashbacks and the night terrors and the ceiling coming down, and I would be slightly claustrophobic. I would always sit so I can see the door and that sort of thing. I still do that, it's just habit now, it's not fear anymore. But so I kind of understand what terror does to you, and I kind of understand what losing your, because one of the things that a bomb or something like that does to you, an attack of that kind, is that it takes away all your certainties. 1 minute everything's fine, and the next minute it's gone. And it's probably like a road traffic accident or something in that context, but I think the difference I found difficult to deal with was somebody had deliberately tried to kill us students. And I found that just this room full of young people, not much, 18, 19, 20, I was 26. So They were very young, and I just found that, as I have always found this, very difficult.
So how would you describe yourself when you consider, you know, the state of our society, of our community? You talked about sectarianism, the ongoing violence, not as bad as it used to be, clearly, but there is still an element of it there. Are you a hopeful person about the situation here?
Yes, I am.
Why?
Because I think the history of human conflict shows that things always come to an end, and that there's always a new dawn coming, you know. I was driving up. The drive from Ballymena to Derry is just brilliant, no matter what the weather. But the drive today, the hills were so beautiful. And I was thinking, this is what coming to Derry is always like for me. It's always this sense of coming into beauty. And I think, in a way, that's what the Troubles have left me with, this sense of a society and a world which has been damaged and broken. But out of that brokenness is growing a sense of purpose and a sense of community and a sense of ownership in the ordinary people. And that, I think, is what gives rise to hope.
There are a number of things you mentioned in your address earlier on, which I'd like to maybe explore a wee bit with you. You used the phrase, for example, at one point, a functional society. That's when all these other measures kick into place. That's what's happened elsewhere in the world. Is that the best that we can realistically hope for? A functional society?
A functional society gives you the concrete base upon which you build everything else. If you haven't got a functional society, if you've built on sand, it's going to keep falling down. So we need a functional society. We need a society where we have an education system, a health system, where we have provision of public services, where children are educated, where people understand that if things happen, they will be dealt with. We need all that kind of functionality in our public service, and I'm not sure it's there. You know.
And you talked as well about the responsibility of the governments.
Yes.
In this. What kind of responsibility do you think they have? Because I mean, I'm conscious of the fact that in the welter of debate at the moment about welfare reform, which you touched upon clearly, I get no sense that the governments really feel any sense of responsibility towards this place, despite the litany of conflict-related physical and mental health problems which bedevil our society.
Yeah, I think in England and Wales and Scotland, they think we've solved the problem and we've gone away. And that's not the case, because we have this legacy with which we have to deal. I don't quite know what the answer is, but I do know that there is a historic responsibility on both the British and the Irish governments because of the way in which they handled the Troubles, because of things which they did that have left them in a position, and I think it's a position that they acknowledge, but they don't divvy up, they don't provide the funding. I think we as a people have to think about the money we're getting. Because, like, in England and Wales, they get £8,000 a head, roughly. In Wales, they get £9,000 a head. In Scotland, they get nearly 10. We get nearly £11,000 a head. So we're getting £2,000 more a head than everybody else in the United Kingdom. We have to work out what we're doing with that money and why we're doing it. And that's why I think we have to look at the money we're spending on parades and protests and all that sort of stuff. We do have the right of freedom of speech and freedom of belief and freedom of opinion, but every right carries with it responsibilities. And I don't think as a society we actually have agreed that we want to spend more money on policing parades than we do on our victims, you know?
So is what you're saying then basically that there needs to be a different, and you would regard it perhaps as a fairer redistribution of existing resources rather than new monies coming in?
I think we need both. I think we need a redistribution of the money we've got. We need to think about how we're using what we've got now. Mm-hmm. But I also think, like, the Stormont House Agreement provides for 150 million for all the initiatives provided for in the Stormont House Agreement, one of which is the provision of a comprehensive mental health service. Another is a legacy investigations unit, a memorial fund, all sorts of things. 150 million just won't pay for that. And it's up to 150 million over 5 years. So that money will not pay for it. And the government must know that money won't pay for it.
So tell me this, I imagine you would say this to other peers when you meet them. You're a crossbench member of the House of Lords. How is that kind of message received by people who believe that the problem here, the conflict here, is over and that the problem is done and dusted?
It's quite interesting because after the panorama, I don't know if any of you saw the collusion panorama, they were coming up to me, you know, some of the old Tories and the military people and that sort of thing, saying, you know, what was all that about? And, you know, we were doing the best we could. And you know, in some cases that's true. But there was a greater demand. There was a problem and we can't turn away and we can't deny it. So although they think the problem is solved, there's a reluctant, I think, maybe not reluctant, but there is an acknowledgement that things aren't right yet. There's a consciousness of huge areas of deprivation, say in the north of England, in Scotland, you know, in Wales, just as much deprivation as we've got here. And so people, the fear I think Cameron has is that the English and Welsh people are going to say, well, we're not going to allow that. And with Scottish devolution and the resettlement of Scotland, that's going to affect the finances. And I think eventually we'll get to a renegotiation on the what's called the Barnett formula, which gives us the money. And that's going to be difficult. So I think we will see, and we have got austerity. We are paying £23,000 a year in interest for every family in the United Kingdom on our national debt. The average income is £26,000 a year. You know, it's just not sustainable. So there is austerity, there will be cuts, etc. I don't have all the answers, I just know what all the questions are.
Well, I would appreciate maybe some advice. I mean, I wonder what you would say to the politicians here before...
Mark's gone.
Mark's away.
Wise man.
He can watch it again later as a result of the streaming service here. But what would you say to the politicians in our community? I talked to two ladies outside the front door of this building earlier on. Just a very quick, very brief conversation about the political situation here, and they were in despair about it, as many people in our community probably are, and in fact one of them said that they're almost embarrassed at the thought of how politicians here would be perceived internationally. So what would you say to our politicians?
I would say that they are elected by the people to do a job. I don't believe the people elect them to move into a place of stasis where nothing can happen. I don't believe that the people elect them to discriminate against the other. So that's not necessary.
So why do people keep re-electing the same?
Yes, I think that's the big question.
People?
And I think that goes back to this fear that still stalks our society, that if we let them get in, they won't be as good as, say, they would be, so we need to get them in so that they can deal with them. It's all us and them stuff. And somehow we've got to move onto the ground of common good. And we're getting there. We're getting there. I mean, when Declan, my husband, was first a member of Ballymena Borough Council, the council would not read a piece of paper if it had any Irish language on it. It's not that they wouldn't discuss it, they wouldn't even read it. We've moved on. So we've made progress. We've just got to make a hell of a lot more progress very quickly. And we owe that to our children.
I think we all would agree. I think everybody would agree that we need to make progress, but I suppose one person's definition of progress is different from another's. Can I just ask you one final point? Well, a penultimate question before opening it to the audience here. Well, one of the things which occurs to me is this issue of justice, and you have devoted your working life to the field of law. When people hear, you know, talk about the need for justice, they want justice. Any right-thinking person anywhere else in the world would say everyone is entitled to justice. Realistically, what can they expect to receive? Yeah,
I think justice is the establishment of the evidence which attaches to a particular incident for individuals. We're talking about individuals now. So it's an analysis of the evidence to determine whether there is somebody who, in respect of whom there is a reason to prosecute, And if there is a reason to prosecute, they go before the courts and let the courts decide. That's what justice is. Now, if the courts decide that there isn't enough evidence to convict them, that's justice too, because nobody should be convicted unless the standard, which is beyond a reasonable doubt, is met. And that's very hard. It's very hard when we know that all the forensics from the weapons, so many of the weapons have gone. you know, and it's not just the bullet tracings and that sort of thing. There'll be other forensic evidence which might be retrievable from weapons. It's very hard when you know that the people who give evidence for the recovery of the remains, people perhaps who took people down those dark, lonely journeys. I mean, there's one case where a priest was staying near the border in a convent, and some men came to the door late at night and said, "We want you to come with us." And it wasn't an invitation or a request, it was an order, and he went with them. And they took him to a barn where a man was held, stripped naked, except for his underpants. He'd been tortured, and they were going to kill him, and he wanted a priest. And the priest was trying desperately to think, what do I do? How do I manage this? How do I stop this? How do I stop this killing? But he couldn't refuse to go to the man because the man needed him. So he was trying to play for time, and he said, "We'll say a decade of the rosary." But your poor fellow had no rosary. And he was feeling in his pockets, and one of the guys who was going to shoot him reached in his pocket and said, "There, Father, there's mine." Terrible things were done, really terrible things. But he was shot dead. He was disappeared. Terrible things were done, and people live with the consequences of what they've done. And sometimes they do come forward, and if they come forward, that brings peace to other people. And we have made a decision as a society that we're prepared to compromise the possibility of a prosecution of the people who did it for the return of the bodies of those who were murdered. And I think that's probably a right decision. It's not easy, nothing is simple. But I think that we must try nevertheless, where there are cases, where there is evidence, we must try to prosecute them. Because if we don't, we're saying all the murders of the past are just gone. And the problem with that is there are people running around our society today who once were involved in paramilitary campaigns, who are now involved in serious organised crime and doing exactly the same things. Shooting people, threatening people, extorting people, you know. So we actually need to deal with them for the crimes they're committing now and for the crimes they may have committed in the past, if the evidence is there. We don't stitch anyone up if the evidence is there.
Well, I'll open questions to the floor very, very, very shortly. What is this, Susan? Oh, all right, here. Someone will grab this here, so if you wait. When we come to you, maybe if you give your name and ask the question loudly and clearly, if that's okay, and speak slowly so we can all hear you. And before we do you consider yourself Irish or English now? Nuala? It's 40 years next year since you first came here?
No, it's 1976, yeah.
76, yeah, 40 years next year.
40 years.
So are you Irish or English?
Northern Irish.
Or Northern Irish?
I was married in Fawn,
Fawn here?
but Church of St Angus, but that's where I was married.
I didn't know that. So, and work
See-
at McGee. Not only are you Irish, you're now a dairy person officially. We've just claimed you. Right, any questions here from anyone in the audience who, yes, here we go. If you just wait for the microphone, yeah.
I wonder, do you think that you're putting too much emphasis on the courts and the official system of proving people guilty of the crimes? It's too long ago. And I wonder if restorative justice might be an alternative, where you got communities together to discuss what actually happened and some of the combatants who were involved in these activities to actually say, I did it, or whatever, to give the families closure. And I think that when you try to bring a thing to court, it just opens it all up again. And if the person's found not guilty, the families say, well, he did it anyway, we know he did it, and so forth. And you go round in the big giant circle. Whereas if you adopted a restorative justice model, you might be able to get at the flags thing, you know, or the parades thing, and say, let's come together, let's discuss it. Let's see if we can't get a mutual solution to this. And that rather than this kind of conflictual approach, we win, you lose, zero sum, you know, as a zero sum constant, you know.
Okay.
Yeah, the Stormont House Agreement does provide for a storytelling process, doesn't it? The question I suppose I would want to ask you is, do you think that the combatants would tell the stories?
I think some of them would.
In what circumstances, and would they expect an amnesty for it?
I think that the important thing really
Looking for a
isn't
pen.
the legal system, because I think it's more about.
See if you move the mic sorry in front of you just there, it'll sound better.
Can anybody lend me a pen?
I
Yeah,
think
here you
it's
Right, it's okay.
it's more about closure for people than
Yeah.
prison.
But you see,
Um,
I've seen situations where people have sat down with people, in just the circumstances you're
Mm.
describing. And sometimes they walk away and they say, "He didn't tell us." So, you know, you talk about the legal system opening up the wounds. Those restorative justice systems can open up wounds as equal to the wounds open. Any time that you try and deal with something which happened in the past, there's absolutely no question about it. You open wounds. And there is a reality that some people do not want to see the people who did what they did to them prosecuted. I don't feel any need that there be a prosecution in respect of my lost child. I grieve for the child, but it was 39 years ago, and it wouldn't benefit me now. I didn't know for a long time who did it until a former paramilitary one day told me it was one of ours, and then looked at me and said, "Oh, I shouldn't have said that," or "That was a mistake." So I think one of the things that we'll have to do as we attempt to deal with this is we will have to meet victims' needs, but we have to be very honest about what victims' needs we're meeting. And we don't have to, I think we need to be careful that we don't allow people to do what happened in the South African Truth Commission and tell half a story and walk away and feel vindicated and have an amnesty. I don't think that's justice, and I don't think that's fair. I don't necessarily, I mean, nobody's really going to go to prison for any length of time. The maximum sentence is 2 years. If you've served time on remand, it's taken double, etc., etc. So people aren't going to be in prison for long periods. What people will say, some people will say, is that they actually want to see a person acknowledge that and be convicted of it. And people have that right
But
in law.
Is that possible?
It can be in some circumstances. I mean, the British government are paying for the Daniel Morgan inquiry, which I'm doing. It was 30 years ago, nearly.
Well, relative
So we
to-
can't have two systems, one for England, where we will deal with the history of the past, and we will have institutional inquiries about child abuse and things like that, and we will put huge resources into it, and then another system for Northern Ireland where we say, go away and forget about your past. That's not...
Thanks for the question, first of all. Any other questions? Yes, over here. Yeah, at the back. Just bear with us. Please.
Is there not as much push on a truth process with rigour, because a lot of our politicians have a lot to lose from a truth process with a lot of rigour, and what's stopping them from not getting involved or not telling the whole truth to protect their career?
I think that's a very valid question.
No answer.
No, I mean, I sat in a meeting in Parliament a year or so ago where we were discussing the murder of Pat Finucane, and there were a number of different people there, and we were discussing just this. And one of the people said, yes, the IRA will tell what happened. They will tell their story if the British government tell theirs. Well, they know that there are some things the British government can't tell. Because, like, I mean, the stuff that I did around identifying informants and the risk of them getting murdered, like, say, Dennis Donaldson, they're huge risks, and the government have legal obligations to protect life. So they can't do that. So yeah, they know perfectly well that the government aren't going to be able to tell everything. So they're never going to have to do it, unless something very strange happens. I'm probably upsetting all sorts of people, but never mind. That's the way I see it. So I don't know the answer to your question, but it does seem to me that we'll never have. And I don't know a society in which there has been a complete truth-telling. But again, if somebody does, do tell me.
Yeah, okay, just 1 second.
My name's Jim. I wonder, could I put this question to you? Do you think any members of the parachute regiment will ever see the outside of a courthouse?
Are you talking about Bloody Sunday?
Yeah.
I don't know. I just don't know. I think one of the difficulties that you have, and I think it was something that was alluded to, was the difficulty of the very, very flawed initial investigation, which means it makes it harder and harder to identify soldier A killing innocent person B, sort of thing, you know. So I don't know, but the parish were involved in Ballymurphy too. And if that had been dealt with, would Bloody Sunday have happened? You know, this is why I think the governments have responsibility.
And presumably it's the government not to delve into that whole area. Yeah. No answer there either. Good indication. Jim, are you okay with that? Or answer? Yeah. Other questions here? Sorry. Yes, over here.
You spoke about the government. Basically, they can't talk about certain things with regards to security and everything like that. In order to move forward with healing, with understanding and things, the investigation on collusion and things like that, do you feel that there would need to be a formal acknowledgement, perhaps by the government, perhaps by politicians, that this happened, and maybe a way in order to, obviously prosecutions, things like that aren't possible, but at least an acknowledgement and recognition of the damage that they cause with regards to collusion and working informants while they were murdering people and things?
Yeah, I think we've seen some of that already.
De Silva, there was an element, wasn't there? The De Silva case.
De Silva led to an apology by the government for the activities of the people, the UDA, UVF, involved in Patrick Finucane's case. We have seen other apologies on other cases. And I think that, you know, there are those who say, well, what's an apology and what's the value of it? When a government faces up to its responsibility and says we got things very wrong, that's very important. But I think it's more important almost for the future, because the war against terrorism, you know, now is a different war from what it was in 2000. If you look at the activities of ISIS and things like that, where, you know, kids are going from the United Kingdom to Syria and to places to fight, we need to protect children from being sort of indoctrinated into that. They need to infiltrate terrorist organizations. Much more of it now will be done, I think, using information processing mechanisms, you know, information technology. But there still will be that need to infiltrate groups, because people know, they always knew, that you maybe didn't want to have a conversation in a room. I mean, even as Police Ombudsman, I always knew that there was a risk that my office might be bugged, like the Garda Ombudsman. You know, you know that there's risk that somebody might have got in and bugged your office. And there are some conversations you just don't have there. And that makes it more difficult then to wage a war against terror. But I think we need to learn the lessons from what happened in Northern Ireland, because they can be learned in order to try and prevent. You know, if you, for example, if you have an informant who's involved in murders and you don't deal with him under the law, then the consequence of that is, or can be, that he goes on and commits more murders. It's a bit like the Brendan Smith that we're hearing about this morning on the radio, you know. They knew in 73 or 76 and they did nothing about it. And he went on to abuse hundreds and hundreds of children. So that's why I think it's important. And I think you're right.
Tony Brown, Pat Finucane Centre.
Mm-hmm.
When you mentioned the war on terrorism, as I understand it, evidence is about to be presented to the International Criminal Court in relation to the events in Gaza. Part of that evidence is that over 1,446 human beings lost their lives, and a third of those were children. That's evidence that has been substantiated by the United Nations. And my question really is, when you talk about involving or infiltrating terrorist organizations, would you make a distinction between what happened in Gaza as being terror on the same grounds as happened in the north of Ireland?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking me, I'm sorry.
Well, basically, when you talk about infiltrating a terrorist organization, would you describe what happened in Gaza as...
Well, Gaza's been running for 50
terrorist
years.
Act, mean? Yeah, but you mean as a terrorist act?
a terrorist
Would you
act?
view it as a terrorist act, the killing of children in Gaza?
Are you I don't know. I really don't know what you're talking about. Are you talking about children killed by the Israelis? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, I wouldn't expect that Hamas have been involved in murders as well.
I mean, if people are murdered, and if they're murdered under the umbrella of war being conducted for political reasons, to me that's terror.
Yes.
No child should be murdered.
Okay. Thank you.
So then it becomes terror. But I'm always cautious. It's like the person who asked me about the parents. If I haven't read the investigation files, I'm not going to say somebody should be in court, because I don't know what the evidence shows. If I don't know precisely which child you're talking about and the circumstances in which they died, I would say they shouldn't die. I would say that they probably were murdered unless it was an accident. But I always feel the need to know the facts before I adjudicate.
Thank you.
One more question, if there's anyone. Yeah, at the very front here, yeah, if you just take, let the mic arrive with you.
Given that, as you said, the national annual debt per head is roughly the same as the national average income per head, is there any hope of finding the money to deal with our social problems here or in the whole of the United Kingdom?
Oh yes, yeah, there is. I mean, I think the government are very rightly restricting the amount of money we're continuing to borrow, but we are continuing to borrow to furnish those debts. It's like when you continue to build your mortgage because you can't repay your mortgage kind of thing, so your credit card debt. But yeah, I think it's about taking the resources we have and dealing with them. I think it's about harnessing our society and enabling people to make a contribution, even when it's not a contribution which results in a payment to them as a salary sort of thing, you know. We used to, as a society, we used to have a much greater level of volunteering and of community support. And that seems to have gone. It's gone with different family structures. It's gone with health and safety law. It's gone with child protection laws. All sorts of things deter people from being involved in community action. But I think we need to resurrect those processes. And it's the younger generation who's got to do them. My guess is most of you are involved somewhere or another in them. But yeah, you see, I'm an optimist at the end of the day.
Could I just put one final question to you, picking up on a question that was asked earlier on? The Finucane family have campaigned long and hard for a full independent inquiry into the murder of Pat Finucane. There has been an admission of collusion on the part of government. There has been an apology. But for the family, that is not enough. So are they likely, in your opinion, to achieve what they're looking for?
I don't know. I've heard it said that that there won't be an inquiry. Sometimes if people just persist, they eventually get something. They did, the silver wouldn't have happened without all the campaigning that Geraldine and Michael and the others did. And it was a very significant achievement. It wasn't the right process. There was no examination of witnesses in the public domain, such as you get in a public inquiry, so I don't know if they'll get one. But they have performed a huge service in telling people what happened, and it never was for them just about Pat's murder. It was always about what was actually going on in our society.
Okay, look, Baroness O'Loan, it's been a pleasure to hear from you and a privilege to talk to you. So maybe you'd like to show your appreciation to our guest today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Just a little small gift for you, Nuala. And hopefully you get a wee walk in the garden before you leave.
Yeah, you're very kind. Thank you very much.
There you go.
Oh, lovely.
You'll see the significance when you go out into the garden, actually.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're very
God
welcome.
bless.
Listen, thank you again to Nuala. Thank you. And just before we wrap up, which has been a very busy week, thank you all so much for coming. It's been a very busy week and sort of the culmination of our project, and we got a good news last week that we have another 2 months, so we will be able to run a few more events over probably the August month, so we look forward to seeing some of you or all of you. And of course, now we have the glorious garden, we will be able to have some of our events in the garden. So the other thing is, sorry? We're not. Do you know what it is? It's a little pebble.
I was wondering what it was.
No, it's a wee pebble.
We traditionally in Derry, when we have a visitor, we like to give them a stone to take away from us. It goes way back, you know.
Very nice pebble.
I just want to quickly thank a few people because it has been a very busy week. I want to thank Mara Communications, Katie, Nicola, Karen and Jane for giving us a great amount of help in terms of pulling everything together throughout the whole week. Stakeholder have been doing great PR work for us. Mac AV who've been doing videoing a lot of stuff all week and live streaming. Thank you guys, and to Unit 7 for doing the sound. And to Holywell Trust, Diversity Community Partnership, and all the staff here in particular. They're always as supportive as always. These things don't happen in a vacuum. It's all about a team, and it's a great team that we have here. And thank you to Marjorie as well. Is Marjorie here? Thank you, Marjorie, as well. It is all about the team. We're really proud of the building. We're really proud of the work of the garden, and we're just really excited that we're going to get doing a bit more of stuff over the few months and into the future. But listen, that's all. It's a lovely day. There's still some of it left. Have a little walk out in the garden. Take your time. You know, it's open to the public.
Could you say if people have any...
Sorry, and thanks to Paul.
Oh, no. You said that earlier.
Sorry, thank you
No,
to
but
Mark.
I just wonder if earlier on... I was going to ask, are there any of you who haven't actually seen the garden or visited the garden yet? It's absolutely fantastic, you know, it's well worth a visit. And just to explain the point about this here, there are a number of artworks out there, and they'll just explain this to you. Among them are a series of stained glass exhibits, art exhibits, which explains the significance of the presentation of this particular artwork to you. And
Thank you.
just encourage you all to go out and enjoy it. And it's called the Garden of Reflection for a reason. The idea is that the people go into it, enjoy the serenity which exists there. It allows them, you know, space for contemplation. And the idea is that we emerge maybe the wiser, the stronger and better people as a result of doing that. So please use it,
Well
do
said.
it, you know, it's brilliant, you know.
Thank you.
Fantastic asset to the city, you know. Great.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Look. Thank you. Thanks.